The radio had been off for the last 2 hours. Sophie didn't need music. She needed the quiet. The kind of quiet that lets you hear yourself think, or more honestly, the kind that lets you avoid it. The Pennsylvania countryside moved past her window in long, slow brushstrokes of green and gray, and she kept her eyes on the road and her hands at 10 and 2 and tried very hard not to feel anything yet. She was 71 years old. She had driven this particular stretch of Route 9 exactly once before in her life, and that time she had been going the other direction. Away. Fast. With her husband's voice still in her ears and her children's silence sitting heavy in the back seat. That was 45 years ago. She had told herself, somewhere around the age of 40, that she had made peace with it. By 50, she believed it. By 60, she had stopped thinking about Willow Creek most days, which is not the same thing as peace, she understood now, but it is a reasonable substitute when peace isn't available. Then the photograph arrived. It came in a plain white envelope, 3 weeks ago. No return address. Her name written in handwriting she didn't recognize. Careful, unhurried letters, like someone who had thought a long time about how to begin. Inside, a single photograph. Their old house on Sycamore Lane. The pale yellow paint. The wooden porch. The rosebush by the gate that she had planted herself in the spring of 1979, when she still believed that planting things meant you intended to stay. She had stood at her kitchen counter in Philadelphia and looked at that photograph for a very long time. On the back, in that same careful handwriting, 4 words. Someone still remembers you. Sophie had put the photograph down. Made herself a cup of tea. Washed the cup. Put it away. Gone to bed. And 3 weeks later, she was on Route 9. She passed the old oak tree at the edge of the county, still standing, still leaning slightly left, like it had always been tired of holding itself up. She remembered passing that tree the day she left. She had looked at it through the rear window as they drove away. She remembered thinking, at least the tree will still be here. At least something will. On the passenger seat, in a small manila envelope, was the photograph and an address. Sycamore Lane, Willow Creek, and a question she hadn't been able to answer in 3 weeks. Who remembered her? And why now? Her daughter had called that morning. "Mom, you don't have to do this." Sophie had said, "I know." Which was true. She didn't have to. She was 71 and she had survived everything this town had handed her, and she owed Willow Creek absolutely nothing. She drove toward it anyway. Because someone still remembers you is not a statement you can put down. Not really. Not when you spent 45 years believing you had been forgotten on purpose. The road curved. The trees thinned. And then, just like that, as if no time had passed at all, she saw it. The green sign. Weathered at the edges, but standing. Still standing. Welcome to Willow Creek. Sophie sat in her car for 14 minutes before she moved again. She counted. She didn't know why she counted. Maybe because counting is something to do when you can't yet decide what to feel. Something moved in her chest when she finally pulled forward. Not fear. Not quite hope. Something older than both. Something that had been waiting, very quietly, for exactly this moment. Before we follow her any further, if a story like this has ever touched your life, or someone you love, hit subscribe. Because tomorrow, I have something even more powerful waiting for you. Let's go back to Sophie. She parked on the far end of Main Street. Deliberately. The way you park when you're not sure you want anyone to see you arrive. For a moment she just sat there with the engine off, looking through the windshield at a town that had kept moving without her for 45 years. Which is what towns do. Which is what everything does. She knew that. And yet, the diner was gone. That was the first thing she noticed. Miller's Diner, where she used to order black coffee and a slice of apple pie every Sunday morning, where the booths had red vinyl seats with small tiers that the owner patched with electrical tape and never replaced. It was a pharmacy now. Clean white signage. Automatic doors. A blood pressure machine visible through the window. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for longer than made sense. The barber shop was a coffee shop. The hardware store was something with a logo she didn't recognize. But the maple trees along the sidewalk, those were the same. Taller now. Their roots had pushed up through the pavement in places, cracking the concrete into small, patient ridges. Nobody had bothered to fix it. Sophie found that oddly comforting. Some things resist being made over. She walked slowly. She told herself she was just looking. Just getting her bearings. She was not hiding, but she was not announcing herself either. She kept her head at a neutral angle, the way you do when you want to see without being seen. 45 years is a long time. She looked different. Surely she looked different. She passed the spot where the old post office used to be, now a small insurance office, and for one strange, sideways second she was 29 again. Standing at that post office counter, mailing a birthday card to her mother. Her youngest was on her hip. The clerk had said something kind. She couldn't remember what. She remembered feeling, in that ordinary moment, that her life was full. That she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Then the moment passed and she was 71 and the post office was gone and her mother had been gone for 20 years. She stopped in front of what had been the flower shop, now a small gift store, the kind that sells candles and locally made jam, and took out her phone to check the address again. Just something to do with her hands. That's when she heard it. Sophie. One word. Her name. But said in a way that made her go completely still. A woman in the doorway. Her age, roughly. Round face, silver hair pulled back without fuss. She was wearing a cardigan the color of dry autumn leaves, and she was holding a paper cup of something that was steaming slightly in the cool air. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't frowning. She was just looking. The way you look at something you have pictured in your mind so many times that seeing it real and three-dimensional in front of you takes a moment to process. Sophie searched for her. Dug back through decades of memory, school, church, the neighborhood, and then it landed. Clara. Clara Whitfield. They had sat 3 pews apart every Sunday for almost 3 years. Their children had played together twice, maybe 3 times. They had never been close, exactly, but they had been the kind of friendly that feels solid. Dependable. The kind you don't think about losing until it's gone. Clara didn't rush over. She didn't exclaim. She didn't do any of the things people do when a surprise is pleasant. She just looked at Sophie across the narrow sidewalk, and then she said, quietly, carefully, like each word had been considered in advance, "I didn't think you'd come. Not welcome back. Not it's so good to see you. Not even the polite, harmless what a surprise. I didn't think you'd come." Sophie opened her mouth. Closed it. Tried again. "Well," she said finally, "here I am." Clara nodded slowly. As if that was an answer she was still deciding what to do with. And Sophie understood, standing there on that cracked maple tree sidewalk in the town that had once been her whole world, that Clara's words were not surprise. They were something closer to warning. Someone had told her Sophie was coming. Someone had been waiting, and whatever they were waiting for, it had already begun. Sycamore Lane was 3 blocks from Main Street. She used to walk it every morning. Sophie took the long way. Not because she was lost. She could have found this street blindfolded, could have counted the exact number of steps from the corner to the front gate, but because she wasn't ready. Not yet. There is a difference between deciding to do something and being ready to do it. She had decided. She was working on the ready. The neighborhood had aged the way people age when they have been loved but not fussed over. The houses were older, yes. Paint had faded in places. A few driveways had cracks running through them like quiet fault lines. But the gardens were kept. The porches had chairs on them. Someone had planted sunflowers along the far fence of the corner lot, and they stood very tall and very yellow in the October light, slightly past their peak but refusing to go. She turned onto Sycamore Lane and stopped walking. There it was. The pale yellow house. Second from the end, same as always, set back slightly from the road with a big elm tree on the left side that used to drop branches every winter and that she had asked her husband to have trimmed about 17 times without result. The elm was still there. Still dropping branches, probably. Still uncut. She had expected ruin. She had prepared herself for it, for peeling paint and broken windows and the particular sadness of a place that has given up. That would have been easier, somehow. A ruined house is finished. A ruined house asks nothing of you. But this house was not ruined. The paint was weathered but whole. The porch floorboards looked newer than the rest. Someone had replaced them, recently enough that the wood still held a lighter color than the frame around it. The windows were clean. Not just not broken. Actually clean, the way windows get when someone wipes them on purpose, when someone stands outside with a cloth and takes the time. The rosebush was by the gate. Her rosebush. She had bought it from a nursery in the spring of 1979 for $4.70. She remembered the price exactly, because she had counted out the coins from the bottom of her coat pocket and felt, for a moment, slightly foolish. A climbing rose, pale pink, the kind that blooms in June and again in September if you feed it well and cut it back right. She had planted it herself, on a Tuesday afternoon while the children napped. She had packed the soil around the roots with both hands and thought, "This is mine. This small, rooted, living thing, this is mine." It was still there. Older, thicker at the base, its canes spread wide across the gate the way old roses do when they have had decades to make themselves at home. It had bloomed recently. She could see the dried heads of the last flowers still clinging to the stems. Someone had been feeding it, cutting it back, caring for it, for 45 years. Sophie stood at the gate and pressed her hand against the iron latch and did not open it for a long time. She was trespassing, technically. She had no deed to this place, no key, no invitation beyond a photograph and 4 words written on the back of it. But her rosebush was on the other side of this gate, alive and tended and waiting, and that felt like a kind of permission she hadn't known she needed. She went in. The porch was swept clean. On the windowsill to the left of the front door, a small clay pot. In it, a sprig of fresh lavender, still purple, still fragrant in the cool air. Sophie touched one of the tiny flowers with one finger and felt something tighten behind her eyes. Her mother had kept lavender on every windowsill in every house she had ever lived in. She said it kept the air honest. Sophie had continued the habit in her own home, for years, until she forgot to, or stopped letting herself. She had told exactly one person in Willow Creek about her mother's lavender. One person, once, a very long time ago. She looked at the clay pot for a long moment. Then she looked more carefully. Tucked beneath the soil, folded small and tight, the corner of a piece of paper was just barely visible. She worked it free with 2 fingers. Unfolded it slowly, the way you open something when you suspect it will change something. On the paper, a single name. Written in that same careful handwriting from the envelope. A name she had not spoken aloud in 40 years. A name she had, somewhere around the age of 50, made a quiet private decision to stop thinking about entirely, because thinking about it hurt in a way she had no word for, and she was tired of hurting over things she could not change. Daniel. The paper said Daniel. And beneath it, in smaller letters, he knew everything. And he is sorry he waited so long. By the second morning, the town knew she was back. She hadn't told anyone except Clara. But Clara had told someone. Or someone had seen her car. Or the woman at the grocery store had recognized her name on a credit card slip. It doesn't matter how it starts in a small town. It only matters that it does. Sophie felt it the moment she stepped outside. A shift in the air. The way 2 women across the street stopped their conversation mid-sentence when she appeared. Not rudely, They didn't stare. They just paused. Recalibrated. The way people do when something unexpected walks into a familiar frame. At the grocery store, a man she didn't recognize moved to a different aisle when she turned down his. She told herself it meant nothing. Maybe it didn't. Then a younger woman, late 40s, dark coat, a basket over one arm, touched Sophie's sleeve near the bread section. Gently, the way you touch someone when you want them to know the gesture is sincere. "My mother talked about you," she said, very quietly. She said what they did wasn't right. Sophie opened her mouth. But the woman was already walking away, head down, as if she'd said something slightly dangerous and needed distance from it. What they did. Sophie stood in the bread aisle for a full minute after that, holding a loaf she didn't need, turning those 3 words over and over like a stone she'd found on a path and wasn't sure whether to pocket or put back. She had always understood her leaving as a private thing. A family matter. Her husband's job transfer. That was the official story, the one that fit neatly into a sentence, the one she had repeated until it became the only version she carried. But private things in small towns are never entirely private. People see. People hear. People file things away in the back of their memory for decades, waiting, not always consciously, for the moment when the truth might finally need somewhere to land. That afternoon she sat on the porch of the pale yellow house. Her house, she was beginning to let herself think of it that way, and tried to count how many people had looked at her differently than she expected. Not with hostility. Not exactly. With something more complicated than that. Something that looked, from certain angles, almost like guilt. She had come here believing she understood the shape of what happened to her. A husband who needed to control. A family that followed. A woman who was quietly removed from the life she had built, like a piece of furniture that no longer suited the room. But what they did suggested something larger. Something that had included more people than she knew. Something the town had watched and remembered and, apparently, never entirely forgiven itself for. She almost left that evening. She got as far as her car. Put her bag in the trunk. Sat in the driver's seat with the key in her hand. The engine off. The street quiet around her in the way that small towns get quiet at dusk, completely, suddenly, like a held breath. She thought about Philadelphia. Her apartment. Her routines. The particular safety of a life where nothing surprises you anymore because you have arranged it, carefully, so that it won't. Then she thought about the clay pot. The lavender. The name on the folded paper. She took the key out of the ignition. Got her bag from the trunk. Went back inside. She made herself tea she didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table until the light outside went fully dark and the house settled into its old nighttime sounds. The creak of the upper hallway, the particular knock of the old pipes, sound she had not heard in 45 years and recognized immediately, the way you recognize a voice from your childhood even when you've forgotten the name that belongs to it. She was almost asleep in the chair when she heard it. A sound at the front door. Not a knock. Softer than that. The quiet, deliberate sound of something being placed. She waited. Counted to 30. Then she went to the door and opened it. The street was empty in both directions. The porch light caught nothing but cold air and the dark outline of the rosebush moving slightly in the wind. On the mat, a plain white envelope. No stamp. No return address. Just her first name, written in that same careful handwriting she had now seen 3 times. Sophie picked it up with both hands. It was light. Whatever was inside had been chosen deliberately. Not thick, not official, not legal. Personal. She stood in the open doorway in the cold for a long moment, the envelope in her hands, and understood that whoever had left it had been watching. Had waited for her light to go on. Had known she stayed. Before she opens that envelope, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been forced to leave a place that felt like home? Or watched someone you love carry that kind of silence for years? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. Now, let's find out what was inside. She didn't open it right away. She set the envelope on the kitchen table and stepped back from it the way you step back from something that has heat coming off it. Made herself a glass of water. Drank it standing at the sink, looking out the window at the dark backyard. The old apple tree still there, still crooked at the same angle, its bare October branches drawn against the sky like a signature. Then she sat down. Pulled the envelope toward her. Opened it. 3 things inside. A letter. Handwritten. 4 pages, front and back. The lines close together the way people write when they have too much to say and are afraid of running out of space before they finish. A photograph. Daniel, younger, standing in front of this very house, one hand on the gate, squinting slightly into the sun. And a legal document, 2 pages, folded carefully. Sophie set the photograph and the document aside and read the letter first. Daniel had written it 3 months ago. He had known by then that he was dying, pancreatic cancer, swift and certain, the kind that doesn't negotiate. He wrote that he had started the letter 6 times over the past 20 years and stopped himself each time. Too much time had passed, he told himself. She had built a new life. It would only hurt her. These were the things he said to himself, he wrote, and then at the bottom of the page he added, "They were also the things I told myself because the truth was harder. The truth was that I was a coward. And I am sorry it took me this long to stop being one." He explained it slowly, carefully. The way a person explains something they have rehearsed many times but still aren't sure they can say without breaking apart in the middle of it. 6 weeks before Sophie's family left Willow Creek, her husband had come to Daniel privately. They had met at the old hardware store, after hours, just the 2 of them. Her husband had told Daniel that Sophie was struggling. That she was saying things, to neighbors, to women at church, things that were making people uncomfortable. That she had become, in his word, difficult. That the family needed to move. That it would be better for everyone if Daniel said nothing, if no one made it complicated, if Sophie left believing it was simply a matter of a job transfer and a fresh start somewhere new. Daniel had agreed. He was 32 years old, and he had believed, with the particular confidence of someone who has not yet been tested, that he was doing the kind thing. That keeping quiet was a form of protection. That sometimes love means letting go without explanation. He understood later, years later, slowly, the way understanding arrives when it has had to travel a long distance, that he had done none of those things. That what he had actually done was choose comfort over courage. His own comfort, not Sophie's. The letter went on. Sophie had not been difficult. She had been becoming. That was Daniel's word, becoming. She had been growing into something her husband could not control and did not understand and, more than anything, feared. She had been reading books he hadn't approved. Talking to women who had ideas he found threatening. Asking questions inside her own marriage that a man like him could not answer without first admitting things he had no intention of admitting. He had not moved his family for a job. He had removed his wife from the people and the place that were making her stronger. Sophie read that paragraph twice. Then she set the letter down on the table and looked at the wall for a long time. She picked up the legal document. It was the deed to the house on Sycamore Lane. Daniel had purchased it the year she left, quietly, through a lawyer, without anyone knowing why. He had maintained it for 45 years. Kept the porch in repair. Fed the rosebush. Wiped the windows. And in his will, he had left it to her. Fully. Legally. Hers. The photograph was still on the table. Daniel at the gate. Young, squinting, one hand resting on the iron latch as if he were guarding something. He had been. All this time he had been. Sophie sat at that kitchen table until the first gray light of morning came through the window. She did not cry. She had spent enough of her life softening the truth to make it easier for other people to be near. This truth she would hold exactly as it was, hard and complete and entirely hers. The only question left was what she intended to do with it. The next morning, Sophie washed her face, made coffee, and called her daughter. She had rehearsed nothing. That was deliberate. Every important conversation she had ever had in her life she had rehearsed first, softened the edges, chosen words that would land gently, arranged the truth into a shape that would be easier for the other person to hold. Not this time. This time she let it come out the way it was. "I need you to listen," she said, when her daughter picked up. "Not to defend anyone. Not to explain anything. Just listen." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "Okay, Mom." Sophie talked for 22 minutes. She told her daughter about Daniel's letter, about the deed, about what her father had done, not with anger, not with a particular bitterness that can build over 45 years into something hard and weaponized, but with the same steadiness she had found sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. "This is what happened. This is the truth of it. I need you to know." Her daughter was quiet for a long time after Sophie finished. Then she said, very softly, "I think I always knew something was wrong. I just didn't have words for it when I was little. And then later I did have words, but I didn't want them to be true." Sophie closed her eyes. Outside the kitchen window, a bird landed in the apple tree and then left again. "I know," she said. "Me too." She had spent 45 years making herself smaller in conversations like this one, agreeing faster than she believed, letting silence stand in for acceptance because acceptance was easier than the alternative. She understood now that this had not been patience. It had been practice, long, exhausting, invisible practice in disappearing. And she was done practicing. That Thursday, she went to the community hall on Elm Street. There was a weekly gathering. She had seen the handwritten sign taped inside the window of the gift store. Thursday morning coffee, all welcome, 9 a.m. mostly older women, she guessed correctly. The kind of gathering that looks, from the outside, like small talk and pastries, and is actually something else entirely. A place where the real business of a community gets conducted quietly, over ceramic mugs, without anyone having to call it what it is. Sophie walked in at 9:15. Found an empty chair near the window. Sat down. She introduced herself to no one. Made no speech. Offered no explanation for her presence or her absence or the 45 years in between. She simply sat, the way you sit when you have decided that you belong somewhere and you are no longer interested in asking permission to feel that way. Within the first half hour, a woman named Ruth, broad shoulders, hearing aid in her left ear, a laugh that arrived before her sentences did, slid her chair 6 inches closer to Sophie's and said, "You're the one who used to live in the yellow house on Sycamore." "I'm back in it now," Sophie said. Ruth nodded, as if this made complete sense. "Good," she said simply. "It suits you." By the end of the morning, 2 other women had moved their chairs into her orbit without being asked. Someone pressed a phone number into her hand. "Call me if you need anything, and I mean anything." Someone else left a covered dish on the chair beside her with a small note that said "Only welcome home" in uneven handwriting, and was gone before Sophie could look up to say thank you. Willow Creek had talked about Sophie Harmon for 45 years. She understood that now. Some had spoken unkindly, perhaps. But most had simply wondered. Carried a quiet unease about the way she left. Filed it in the back of their conscience alongside other things they hadn't handled well and hadn't fully forgiven themselves for. Her being here did something to that unease. Gave it somewhere to go. She was gathering her coat to leave when Clara appeared in the doorway of the hall. She stood there for a moment, scanning the room, and when her eyes found Sophie they stayed. She looked different than she had outside the gift store, less guarded, or perhaps just more tired of being guarded. She crossed the room and sat down in the chair Ruth had vacated and folded her hands on the table and said, "There's something I should have told you the moment I saw you. I've been trying to find the courage since Tuesday." Clara had been in the room. That was the thing she had carried for 45 years. Not a rumor. Not something she heard secondhand over a backyard fence. She had been physically present, standing in the hallway of Margaret Finley's house at a gathering she now wished she had never attended, when Sophie's husband had described his wife to 3 other men in the careful, measured tone of someone who has practiced sounding reasonable. She was 28. He was older, confident, the kind of man who filled a room without raising his voice. He had called Sophie unstable, had said she was struggling, that the move was, really, for her own good, that it was a kindness. The 3 men had nodded. Clara had stood in the hallway with a glass of lemonade going warm in her hand and had said nothing. She had told herself, driving home that night, that it wasn't her place, that marriages were private, that she didn't know the full picture. These are the things we tell ourselves when we know the truth and choose the easier thing anyway. Clara had told herself this story for 45 years. She was done telling it. Sophie listened to all of it without moving. She did not reach across the table to comfort Clara when her voice broke on the word kindness. She did not say it's all right or you were young or any of the softening things she might once have instinctively offered. She simply let Clara finish. Let the truth take up all the space it needed. When Clara was done, her eyes were wet. Sophie's were not. "You were young," Sophie said finally. "So was I. The difference is that I had to live it, and you had to watch it. Both of those things are real." Clara reached across the table and took Sophie's hand. Neither of them spoke for a while. The coffee between them went cold. Outside, a car passed slowly. The hall was nearly empty now, just the 2 of them and the particular silence that settles when something long overdue has finally been said. Then Sophie said the thing she had never said to anyone. Not to a therapist, not to her daughter, not even to herself in the dark privacy of 3 a.m. when truths tend to surface whether you want them to or not. "I wasn't difficult. I was just becoming myself. And that frightened him." She said it quietly, without drama. The way you say something that has been true for a very long time and has simply been waiting for the right moment to be spoken out loud. She walked home alone that evening through the cool October streets, her hands in her pockets, the maple trees overhead holding the last of their color. She did not feel victorious. She did not feel healed, exactly. Healing is slower than one conversation, and she knew that. But something had been set down. Gently, finally, on the ground beside her. And she did not pick it up again. Sophie decided to stay. Not because Willow Creek had earned it. Not because anyone had apologized adequately or explained themselves fully or done enough to deserve her return. She stayed because she wanted to. Because the pale yellow house on Sycamore Lane had her rosebush in the garden and her mother's lavender on the windowsill and new curtains she had chosen herself. A deep, quiet blue that she had always loved and never once, in her entire married life, been allowed to simply choose. She had the locks changed on a Tuesday. It felt significant, that small act. Her key. Her door. Her house. Gerald stopped her outside the pharmacy one afternoon. Gerald, the man who had crossed to the other side of the street the first day she arrived, whose avoidance she had read as hostility and which turned out to be something closer to shame. He stood in front of her on the sidewalk with his hands in his coat pockets and said, simply, "Good to see you back, Sophie." Not an apology. Not an explanation. Just those 7 words, offered plainly, like a small and honest thing he had been carrying around waiting to put down. She accepted them the same way. "Thank you, Gerald," she said. And they went their separate ways, both of them a little lighter. Her daughter came in October. They sat on the porch wrapped in blankets until well past midnight, the street dark and quiet around them, talking in the way they had never quite managed before, not as mother and child arranging themselves around an old hurt, but as 2 women who had both been shaped by the same silence and were finally, carefully, ready to name it. It was painful. It was also, underneath the pain, an enormous relief. Sophie understood something now that she could not have understood at 30, or even at 60. Home is not always the place where you were happiest. Sometimes home is the place where you were most yourself, before someone decided that was a problem. Returning does not mean going backward. Sometimes it means finally arriving at the place you were always supposed to reach, just from a longer road than you planned. She had been sent away from Willow Creek as a woman being quietly erased. She came back as a woman who knew exactly who she was. Not loudly, not dramatically, just fully, completely, without apology. The rosebush bloomed that November. It wasn't supposed to. October had been cold, the nights sharp, and roses don't bloom in November in Pennsylvania. But on a Tuesday morning Sophie stepped onto the porch with her coffee, and there it was. One bloom. Pale pink, frost on its edges, holding itself upright in the cold, as if it had been waiting for exactly the right moment to prove that some things, no matter how long they have been waiting, do not forget how to open. If Sophie's story felt familiar, if it reminded you of your mother, your grandmother, or a part of yourself you left behind somewhere, share this with them. Sometimes a story is the only way to say what we never could. And if you're new here, subscribe. Because every week, we tell the stories the world forgot to tell. We'll see you in the next one.